Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to listen to my talk. Today, I'll be speaking about work that I'm doing with Thomas Ulrich and Elise Gabriel at LMU. And it is exploring the effects of fluid pressure on megathrust mechanics and earthquake dynamics. So pore fluid pressure is one mechanism that may explain multiple observations of subduction zone megathrust behavior. But its coseismic state and its influence on rupture dynamics are not well understood. So that's our motivation for this work. What do we know about fluid pressure? Well, it may be moderate during the interseismic period. So this is a diagram from Saffer and Tobin, 2011, and it is showing moderate fluid pressure here along the locked seismogenic zone, and perhaps higher pore fluid pressures up dip and down dip of that locked zone. More recently, Heiss et al. In 2017 did a resistivity study of the Hikurangi subduction interface and found a lack of fluid or low fluid pressure inferred from that high resistivity. And they co-located the patch with a geodetically identified coupled region, which is shown by the black lines here. So indicating that low fluid pressure may co-locate with locked regions. There is also evidence that pore fluid pressure is high, lithostatic, during the interseismic region. And this comes from VPVS studies here within the subducted crust at Cascadia. So the inferred Poisson's ratio from these VPVS ratio data does not match subduction zone lithology. And extrapolating the relationship between Poisson's ratio and pore fluid pressure does indeed suggest lithostatic fluid pressures. So this has also been shown in increases in VPVS following the 1995 Antofagasta earthquake. So the idea here is that during the interseismic period, fluids trapped in the downgoing plate lead to high pore pressures along the megathrust, or at least underneath the megathrust. And in the post-seismic period, VS in the overriding plate decreases as arriving fluids force cracks open and increase the pore pressure. And this is showing that VPVS ratio in the hanging wall above the subducting plate off the coast of Chile here. So there is some evidence that that pore fluid pressure is lithostatic during interseismic, perhaps, and during the post-seismic period. But what happens coseismically? So this is what we explore with dynamic rupture models run with SeisSol of the 2004 Sumatra-Andaman earthquake, which is shown here and ruptured 1,200 kilometers of the trench off the coast of Indonesia. We use a non-planar megathrust geometry shown here. This is the region near the surface. This is at about 50 kilometers depth. We have layered materials, both in the oceanic and continental crust. And we use an elastic constitutive law. We also use a linear slip weakening law to describe the frictional behavior of the fault. And we use constant friction coefficients, which I'll discuss more later. We have a spatially constant stress orientation with the maximum compressive stress oriented at 225 degrees and plunging just 7 degrees. And this is from aftershock focal mechanism inversions. So we don't try to match all observations of this earthquake, but we do use this as our base model. So we compare 4 scenarios with pore fluid pressure ranging from low or hydrostatic up to very high or 97% of the lithostatic load. So these are scenarios 1, 2, 3, and 4. The way that we assign the pore fluid pressure is by, the way that we assign these principal stresses is by basing them all on the vertical principal stress, which we then add the pore fluid pressure to. What happens is we begin each model with the same absolute stress field. Here I'm showing a profile of the maximum S3 principal stress, the intermediate, and the minimum principal stress with depth. Here is after the pore fluid pressure is applied. In this case, we have the same values on the x-axis. In this case, we do not. That's why I've highlighted them here. So as we go from scenario 3 to scenario 4, we get lower effective principal stresses, and we also get lower differential stresses. And this is a result of the way that we apply the pore fluid pressure here. And I'll explain the implications of that a bit on this slide. So both the shear traction and the normal traction vary when we apply pore fluid pressure. So this is scenario 3. You can see the shear tractions here range from 0 to 25 megapascals. The pattern is same in scenario 4, but the range only goes from 0 to 10 megapascals. This is the same with the normal stress. It might also be helpful to think about how the stresses are varying near the megathrust in a Moore circle representation. So as these Moore circles increase, we are moving down the megathrust from 5 to 23 kilometers depth here. So again, both shear stress and normal stress are varying, both shear traction and normal traction are varying. You might also see some additional variation here because the tractions also vary with the fault geometry, which is not planar. Because of the way that we apply the pore fluid pressure here, the ratio of the shear traction to the normal traction varies along the megathrust, but it does not vary from scenario to scenario. So scenarios 1 through 4 all have this same ratio of shear to normal traction. Dynamic rupture modelers sometimes look at the R, the pre-stress ratio, which is the stress drop divided by the breakdown stress drop. That's what's shown here. And again, this does not vary from scenario to scenario. Because this ratio doesn't change, we can keep the friction coefficients constant across all scenarios. So we do not explore in these models the influence of the friction coefficients on the results. Those are constant. In general, what we see is that as the pore fluid pressure decreases, as the fluid pressure increases, the following decrease: the fault strength, the earthquake magnitude shown here, a cumulative slip shown here. These are average values in this table. The peak slip rate decreases on average. The average stress drop decreases, and the average rupture velocity decreases. The preferred scenario is scenario 4, which has a very high pore fluid pressure at 97% of the lithostatic load and very low shear and normal tractions on the megathrust. It's our preferred model because it does produce results that are consistent with observations of the 2004 event, including inferred mean stress drop of 3 megapascals and a mean rupture velocity of about 2.5 kilometers per second. As I mentioned, we also compare these results that have depth-dependent stresses with 2 additional scenarios that have constant normal stresses. We only do this for high and very high pore fluid pressures, since those are the models that really produce reasonable results under these depth-dependent stress conditions. So if we look at the Moore circle representation again, scenario 4 is shown here. Scenario 6 is shown here, and we see a constant values because of the way we've applied the pore fluid, or because of the conditions we want to represent in this model of constant normal stress with depth. And you can see the difference in the tractions on the megathrust here, scenario 4, here, scenario 6. The color bars remain the same, but the patterns are quite different. So we see very constant normal stress along the megathrust. We see fairly constant shear stress, though we still do have the effects of fault geometry here. Why do we do this? Rice in 1992 showed that fluid at elevated pressures within a fault zone might follow the lithostatic gradient, and this actually turns that depth-dependent normal stress into a constant effective normal stress. And this is something that's been observed in crustal sedimentary rocks as well, for example, by Suppi 2014. So we were interested in understanding the effects of this condition on the rupture mechanics and the earthquake dynamics. Once again, though the tractions vary, the ratio of the shear traction to the effective normal traction does not. And again, this is now consistent from scenario 1 through scenario 6. So what do we see? Relative to a depth-dependent normal stress, applying a constant effective normal stress moves the peak slip up dip. So here are results for scenario 4. This is with a depth-dependent normal stress. Here are results for scenario 6. This is with a constant normal stress. And the darker red region showing the highest slip has moved up dip here, and it's a little bit higher in general. The peak slip rate also moves up dip, and the stress drop is more constant along the megathrust here, whereas it's concentrated at depth in the earlier models. We also see that for the same or a lower mean stress drop, we get higher earthquake magnitude, higher mean slip, and a higher rupture velocity. So what do I mean? If we compare scenario 3 with a depth-dependent normal stress with scenario 5 with a constant normal stress, the magnitude goes up, slip goes up on average, the average peak slip rate goes up, the average rupture velocity goes up, but the stress drop actually decreases. So from these models alone, it's difficult to conclude the likelihood of either condition, but we do want to make the point that if very high coseismic pore fluid pressure does cause constant normal stress conditions along a megathrust, then this approximation should be used to estimate fault strength characteristics or megathrust strength characteristics in subduction zones. So typically when such calculations are done, a depth-dependent normal stress is assumed. And this may be causing incorrect assumptions about the strength of the megathrust. The last thing I want to talk about today are stress rotations. So here is a figure showing the orientations of the maximum principal stress in blue and the minimum principal stress in red. The intermediate principal stress is hidden behind blue here, and this is before the earthquake. As I said, this is spatially constant. After the earthquake, what we see are that the rotations are similar across scenarios, and that they are larger in the hanging wall relative to the footwall. And I've analyzed them here just close to the fault within this box here. In general, the maximum compressive stress rotates toward parallel with the trench. It doesn't change its plunge very much. The other two principal stresses do change in plunge. Sigma 2, which is initially horizontal, plunges more steeply. Sigma 1, which was initially almost vertical, plunges less steeply after the earthquake. So we get a much more heterogeneous post-earthquake stress field. I do also want to mention that in scenario 4 and scenario 6, which are our preferred scenarios, the difference between the magnitudes of the maximum and minimal principal stresses is quite low. So varying between 0 to 10 megapascals or perhaps even between 0 and 5 megapascals. Again, we're most interested in this area close to the fault and in the hanging wall. We find that the post-earthquake stress field is consistent with a variety of aftershock focal mechanisms, which are observed. So out of 125 magnitude 5 aftershocks or larger that have focal mechanism solutions and that occur along the central part of the rupture, which corresponds to where we took these slices in our model, and that occur within 1 month of the main shock, we have 63 strike slip aftershocks were observed, 29 reverse, 31 normal, and 2 uncategorized. And our results are consistent with this. And we might imagine that if we began with a heterogeneous stress field, that the post-earthquake stress field would be even more heterogeneous. And that we have a lot of room for additional switching between the principal stresses because of how similar they are in magnitude in the post-earthquake stress, or in the post-earthquake time frame. So in summary, we've evaluated the role of the pore fluid pressure on subduction zone fault mechanics and earthquake dynamics with SeisSol models, dynamic rupture. We found in general that increasing the pore fluid pressure decreases fault strength, earthquake magnitude, as well as a series of earthquake characteristics. Our preferred scenarios have very high pore fluid pressure, very low tractions, which lead to low stress drop and low rupture velocity earthquakes. We also compare two different normal stress conditions relative to a depth-dependent normal stress. A constant normal stress moves peak slip and peak slip rate up dip and produces a more constant stress drop along the megathrust. We also see that for the same or a lower mean stress drop in these models, magnitude is higher, mean slip is higher, and mean rupture velocity is higher. So we can't differentiate the likelihood of either scenario, or we can't conclude the likelihood of either condition from these models alone. We're still continuing to look at this. But if constant normal stress is present, then it should be considered when considering strength characteristics of subduction zones. We also looked at the post-earthquake stress field, and we found that it is consistent in the model. The models are consistent with the variety of aftershock focal mechanisms observed. And we also note how close the maximum and minimum principal stress magnitudes are in our preferred scenarios. And we can imagine that in combination with a more heterogeneous initial stress field, really a variety of aftershock focal mechanisms are possible. So thank you very much for your time. I'm looking forward to our live session in a few weeks. Please feel free also to email me with any questions at betsymadden@gmail.com. Thanks very much.